Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, your host for Heroes in the Bible, Jesus. If you've enjoyed this podcast so far, please share it with your family and friends so they can know Jesus Christ in a personal way, because knowing Jesus is the key to understanding the Bible. Welcome to the greatest story ever told. It is a story of a shepherd's heart for his sheep, a father's love for his children, and a hero's triumph over death and darkness. This is a story that continues to shape and mold the world around us, bringing the divine heart of God right into the hearts of you and me. This episode reminds us of Jesus' heart for the downtrodden, defenseless, and pure of heart. As we have gone through the life of Jesus so far, I can't help but be compelled by just how many stories there are of Jesus caring for the individual. He helped people who were sick, listened to people who were broken, and rebuked the powers of darkness that sought to corrupt people. Jesus cared deeply, and that should make us want to do the same. These stories are powerful, and they cut at the parts of us that just want to look out for number one. I pray this episode grips your soul, especially as you hear Jesus' heart for children. Before we dive into the works and words of Jesus, we will begin with a prelude. This prelude features a character very few people know about. His story is short and often lost behind the shimmering veneer of King David's life. However, this mighty man of valor's moment in Scripture reminds us that God's heart is for the weak and feeble. He will stop at nothing to defend the helpless from evil. The prelude and the episode afterward invite us to ask how we can defend the defenseless and love the outcast. My prayer for you today is that the shepherding heart of God would be on full display for you to see. I pray Jesus' words would remind you that you are loved despite your brokenness. I pray that this episode would inspire you to seek Jesus for guidance, provision, healing, acceptance, just as the characters of this story did. Here is episode 12, The Good Shepherd.
Prelude to chapter 12. Shammah breathed in deeply, looking out onto the Philistine horde approaching. Their spears were set and their swords were secured tightly. Shammah exhaled, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The farmers of Lehi had retreated into their homes, watching from the windows as Shammah stood alone. He stood in the lentil field. Bushes swayed gently to the wind. The earth began to shake as the Philistines came closer. All the men of the city had fled, but not Shammah. He knew that this little patch of farm was the only livelihood the people of Lehi had. He would not let it be taken by Philistine dogs. The opposing army picked up their pace, working their way into a sprint. Shammah set his feet, widening his stance. He drew his sword and braced his shield. The 24 Philistines closed the gap and lunged at him with spears and swords. Shammah lifted his stance like an elegant dance. Shifting and moving his feet and hips, he dodged every advance and responded with a swift swing of his sword. One Philistine got an edge on him and drew him back with his shield. However, Shammah regained balance quickly and tossed a dagger that was attached to his hip. A direct hit. Two more advanced towards him. One was met with a quick jab to the belly, and the other was sent to his back with a blow from Shammah's shield. He fought for what seemed like hours. As he held his ground, the Philistines that were still alive retreated, leaving the lentil field alone to the people of Lehi. Shammah panted. Blood dripped down his armor, and his face was covered in dust and sweat. But he had done it. He defended the lentil field from the Philistines. He did not defeat a giant, nor did he lead an army into battle. This mighty man of David stood his ground against a foe that sought to take advantage of the weak and helpless. He was one man against many, yet God empowered him to victory. This is because God's heart is always for those who cannot help themselves. God's heart is for the vulnerable, the weak, and the helpless. So he sends his heroes to respond to the needs of those who cannot help themselves. This is the heart of God and the heart of his Messiah. Chapter 12. The Good Shepherd. Jesus descended down the mountain with Peter, James, and John. Their faces still wore the shock and awe of what had just occurred. They were able to see the heavenly radiance of Jesus unveiled for a moment. On that mountain, they were able to comprehend the greatest miracle of Jesus. His greatest miracle was not turning water into wine, healing the blind, or calming the storm. The miracle occurred every day as he continually held back the entirety of his glory. As they reached the base of the mountain, a large commotion could be heard from camp. Peter was the first to respond and run. The others followed, hurrying down the path. They reached camp and found a large crowd violently arguing with the rest of the disciples. Jesus saw a few members pointing at the disciples.
"Frauds!"
they shouted.
"Who are you to call yourselves disciples of Jesus?"
Peter lunged himself into the crowd, separating them from the disciples. It only made them more angry. One of them swung at Peter, but before he could respond, Jesus rushed into the scene and the attention of the crowd was diverted. His very presence changed their countenance.
"What is going on here?"
Jesus asked. The crowd parted, and a man emerged holding his son in his arms. He was a short and portly man, quite possibly a butcher by trade. His strong arms held up his boy, who could not have been older than 10 years of age. The boy was limp in his father's arms, grunting incessantly.
"Teacher,"
the man said, bowing before Jesus.
"I brought my son to you. A spirit has taken him."
Jesus peered at the boy. His eyes were rolled back, and his neck twitched from side to side. He scanned the boy's body. It was covered in burn marks. The father took notice of Jesus' eyes and began to weep.
"The spirit comes without notice,"
he said with watered eyes.
"He'll take control of my son and throw him into the fire. And he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth. And then he will throw my son into the water to drown."
The man clenched his eyes closed, holding his son tightly.
"I came to your disciples so they might cast out the demon, but they couldn't. They gave me hope, and it has been shattered."
The man broke down, unable to console himself. Jesus caught a glimpse of the Pharisees and scribes smirking in the corner. They reveled in the disciples' inability to cast out the demon. Jesus walked forward with his chest held high and fists clenched. He pointed to them with his gaze as intense as a bolt of lightning.
"You crooked and perverse generation!
He shouted.
Faithless! That is what you are! How long must I endure you?"
Jesus looked at the child. He was in much pain.
"Bring me the boy,"
Jesus said. As the father lifted his arms to hand the boy to Jesus, the demon awoke from his slumber. He had felt the presence of the Messiah and knew his time was almost up. The demon was determined to do as much damage as he could with the few moments he had left. The boy leapt out of the father's arms onto the ground. The demon thrashed his body onto the floor, banging his head against the rocks. Foam spit forth from the boy's mouth, and his eyes rolled back into their sockets. The crowd recoiled, terrified that the boy might harm them if they got too close. The father fell on top of his son, trying to restrain him, but the demon was too powerful. He threw the father off of him and leapt towards him, grabbing his throat. The entire crowd could hear the slight cracking of the father's throat. The demon was unnaturally strong. Jesus stepped forward, grabbing the boy from on top of his father. He restrained him in his arms. The boy thrashed back and forth, screaming with blood-curdling volume. The father gasped for air, sobbing at the sight of his son. The boy writhed in Jesus' arms, yet Jesus remained calm, making sure to not harm him. He looked at the father and asked,
"Do you believe I can heal you, son?"
The father opened up his hands to Jesus and shook his head.
I believe, Lord."
There was a pause as the father stared at his son. For years this demon had plagued him. He had begun to lose hope that anything would change.
"I believe. But help my unbelief."
Jesus nodded. The man's response was honest and pure. He did not give any false platitudes or promises. He simply shared the state of his heart. He brought his real and honest emotions. Jesus held the boy close, hugging him as he struggled. Jesus' teeth clenched and his brow furrowed. He hugged the boy with the loving embrace of a father. Then, with authority, he spoke to the demon deep within.
You mute and deaf spirit, hear the voice of your Creator. I command you to come out of this boy and plague him no more.
The boy's screams increased to a deafening level. He convulsed and thrashed his body until finally going limp. Jesus set him down gently on the floor. The boy seemed dead for a moment. However, Jesus grabbed his hand and lifted him up on 2 feet. The boy was restored, and the father felt like he was meeting his son for the first time. The disciples departed from Galilee, concerned about what they had just seen. Jesus knew that there were greater troubles ahead for them, yet there was no way for them to truly understand. How could they? In many ways, the kingdom of heaven was upside down compared to the common culture of mankind. However, Jesus still saw it fitting to prepare his disciples for events to come.
The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men.
Jesus said.
They will kill him, and he will raise himself up on the 3rd day.
As Jesus spoke these things, the disciples struggled. They said nothing, afraid of the answers to their questions. They had made their way to Capernaum, and a large group was gathering in a household. Peter reclined at the table, enjoying a rare moment of silence with his own thoughts. However, the moment was quickly interrupted as a temple official approached him.
"Ah, Simon,"
the man said as he sat down. He patted Peter on the back and said,
"I heard you might be here with Jesus. It has been a while."
Peter gulped. The man was a temple tax collector, and Peter had been behind on his temple tax for quite some time. The man sat next to him and poured a drink from the basin sitting on the table. He sipped casually, enjoying the tension he caused Peter.
"Tell me, Simon, does your teacher pay his taxes, unlike some in this room?"
Peter buried his head into his hands and sighed. He was a lowly fisherman without much coin to spare. On top of this, he was responsible for his wife and mother-in-law.
He does.
Peter answered quickly. Then he got up from his seat and walked out of the house. The collector smirked as Peter walked away. Peter stepped out onto the patio. He rubbed his temples and sighed. He felt a great deal of guilt about not being able to afford his temple tax. It was one thing to avoid taxes imposed by Rome, but to not contribute to the temple of God was a source of shame. Peter looked up to the stars, unaware of Jesus sitting a few feet in front of him. Peter was lost in thought, reeling in guilt. Then he heard Jesus speak into the silence.
Come and sit, Peter,
Jesus said, gesturing to a spot on the small wall next to him. Jesus would often retreat to be alone with God. Peter felt honored to sit next to him during one of these moments. Jesus turned to Peter.
Tell me what you think, Peter. When kings tax the land, do you think they tax their own sons or others?
Jesus asked.
Others?
Peter answered plainly. Jesus nodded.
Sons are free. A father would never let his son pay the taxes of everyone else. However, in order to not needlessly offend others, I pay the tax, and so should you.
Peter held his head low as he spoke. Jesus gave him a pat on the shoulder.
Spend some time down by the sea to clear your mind. Cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. Open its mouth. There you'll find a shekel. That should cover the tax for me and for you.
Peter did as he was told. He sat with a rod and line in the water, watching the moonlight reflected in the sea. The line tugged, and a fish appeared out of the water. Peter opened its mouth, and lo and behold, something shined in the moonlight. Peter pulled out a shekel. He could not help but chuckle. Jesus had strange ways of providing, but he always came through. The next day, Jesus was teaching to a large group near the Sea of Galilee. The seagulls flew high above them, descending into the waters below. Jesus sat at the edge of an elevated stone, and hundreds of people sat below on the shore. Jesus spoke about the kingdom of heaven. He spoke about the greatness of God's will, acted out in the hearts of people.
Teacher, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? How can I or any of us truly be great?
Someone asked. Jesus nodded at the question. He gestured towards some of the children playing in the sand near the water. He waved at them to come over, and they happily ran and climbed up the rock. One of the children leapt onto Jesus' lap, and the other climbed up on top of his shoulders. Jesus laughed, allowing them to play with his hair and jump off his back.
You see these children?
Jesus asked.
They are humble and approach me with joy. Their faith is pure and undefiled. Whoever is like one of these children is greatest in the kingdom of God.
One of the children sat quietly on Jesus' lap, playing with a stone she found on the shore. Jesus looked at each child with love. Then he looked seriously at the crowd.
Whoever accepts and loves a child in my name also receives me. However, whoever causes one of these little ones harm or causes them to sin, it would be better for him to have a stone fastened around his neck and thrown into the bottom of the sea.
The people gasped at Jesus' intensity. However, he had a heart for the innocent and needed to make it clear that those who harm the innocent will not go unpunished. The children jumped off the stone and ran back to find shells on the shore. Jesus smiled, then returned his gaze to the crowd.
Temptation to sin is everywhere. There's a great sorrow in the world because of it,
he said.
However, it is necessary that temptations come in this way. Our faith is strengthened in them. However, you must be careful. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off.
Jesus gestured with his hands, cutting off his arm. The crowd gasped and flinched. However, Jesus spoke in metaphor, showcasing the lengths we must go to separate ourselves from sin.
It is better for you to be without an arm or a leg than to be thrown in eternal fire. So if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Throw it away. It is better that you enter life with one eye than two eyes in eternal death.
The people nodded, understanding the severity of their sin. However, it would be hard to uphold the high standard of Jesus. They would need help, and Jesus was determined to give it. Jesus gestured at the children again. People watched as they played innocently near the water. Their laughter was contagious and caused the crowd to laugh as well. Jesus smiled and looked at the crowd, looking at the children. They were his little ones. He saw them in the same way they saw the children. He lifted his voice and reminded them of his heart.
Let us say a shepherd has 100 sheep. He tends to them well within his pasture. However, one of them falls astray and wanders off into the wilderness where predators lie in wait. The shepherd takes action and leaves the 99 sheep in search of the one. He ascends into the mountains. He risks death and injury to save the one sheep who went astray. Then he finds the sheep, and his entire household rejoices. That is the heart of my Father in heaven. It is not his will that any should perish.
Jesus peered out into the crowd. In the corner, he could see two men facing each other, disputing silently.
Forgive one another!
Jesus shouted. The men quickly ceased their arguing, embarrassed that Jesus had caught them. He smiled and shook his head. Then he turned to the rest of the crowd.
If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Do not bring others into it unless you've spoken to him first. Be honest with one another. If he does not listen, bring a few more so they may be witnesses to your dispute and help. If he refuses to listen still, bring him to the church so they might lovingly lead him. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in the midst of dispute, I will be in their midst to aid.
Peter looked at his brother Andrew. He smirked. The two of them had had many disputes in their lives. Andrew was more level-headed and quiet. However, Peter was brash and loud.
How many times should I forgive my brother?
Peter asked.
The rabbis tell us to forgive 3 times. Shall we forgive more? Perhaps 7 times?
Peter's number was generous. However, Jesus had a different number in mind.
No, Peter, not 7, 77.
The crowd laughed at the absurd number. However, Jesus was not joking. He held up his hand and told them a story.
There was a ruler who wished to settle his accounts with servants he lent money to. One of the servants owed him 10,000 talents. Surely it was a number too great to repay. Since he could not pay the debt, the ruler offered for the servant and his family to be sold into slavery to repay the payment. The servant leapt onto the floor and fell on his face. He begged the ruler, forgive me of my debt." Although he did not deserve forgiveness, the ruler gave it anyway, for he was merciful and kind. The very same day, the ruler was walking about the city when he caught a glimpse of the very same servant arguing with another man. He watched as the servant swung at the man, hitting him to the floor. The two of them fought and thrashed at one another until the servant came on top of him and began to choke him. "Pay me what you owe me," the servant yelled. As it turns out, the servant owed the man 100 talents. The man gasped for air and begged for mercy. "Please forgive me of the debt." Yet the servant did not have mercy. When the ruler heard this, he summoned him. "You wicked servant! I forgave you all your debt, yet you choked this man for 100? In his anger, the ruler sent him out into the prison.
Jesus paused and allowed the crowd to understand the message.
"You have been forgiven much,"
Jesus said.
"The same will happen to you if you do not forgive others."
With that, Jesus departed with his disciples. There were things to prepare for Jesus was about to set his face to Jerusalem. Desiring for the entire region around him to hear the proclaimed gospel, Jesus sent out his disciples into different regions so he might preach. However, the Samaritan village nearby would not receive him. James and John boiled with rage that they would reject Jesus. They steamed with anger and bickered amongst themselves on how they should respond. Finally, they came to Jesus and said,
"Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven to obliterate those who reject you?"
Jesus looked at them, dismayed. His face showed shock, worry, and anger that they would even suggest such a thing.
"Of course not."
Thus, he nicknamed both of them Sons of Thunder. As the rest of them were walking into another town, a man came to them. He approached Jesus smugly, prepared to follow Jesus wherever he went.
"Lord, allow me to follow you wherever you go,"
the man said with a grin. He held himself with confidence. He had seen Jesus heal the sick and multiply food. He saw the crowds call to make him king and await his revolution to the throne. To him, Jesus' life seemed glamorous. He desired to be a part of it and share in the glory. Jesus did not shoo the man away. Instead, he painted him a picture of what it was truly like to follow him.
"Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He has no home to call his own or comforts to return to. So, follow me if you desire."
The man paused for a moment. He responded trepidatiously, saying,
"Well, perhaps I should first tend to my father before he passes and secure my inheritance. Once he is gone and I have buried him, I can return to follow you."
Jesus shook his head.
"Leave the dead to bury their own dead. As for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God."
Another man approached Jesus and said,
"Lord, I will follow you, but first allow me to say goodbye to my family."
Jesus shook his head again.
"You do not understand yet the weight of what you are seeking. No man can put his hand to the plow and look back. The line becomes jagged and crooked. No man is fit to commit to the kingdom of God if he looks back."
Jesus sat on a stone beside the road. A large caravan of people were packing to depart from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus watched as families packed food, instruments, and sacrifices for the Feast of Booths. It was an entire celebration where families camped in makeshift booths outside Jerusalem to remember Israel's time in the wilderness.
Are you coming, Jesus?
Jesus looked up and saw his brothers approaching. James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon were all packing their things to depart. Jesus would not go with them. The religious leaders were waiting for him there. He had known about their plot to kill him, and there were still a few things to do before he would give himself up. His brothers stood over him with their arms crossed. They knew better than anyone that Jesus was unique, yet they were skeptical of his miracles and had issues with his claims to be the Son of God.
Why have you remained in Galilee so long?
Jude asked.
No one respects Galileans. If you really want to be known for all your words and miracles, you would do them in Jerusalem. That is where the people that matter are.
If you really do these things, why remain in an anonymous region like Galilee?
James chimed in.
Come with us. We would also like to see you make a name for yourself.
There was sarcasm and snark in their voices. They did not believe in him. However, they would soon see for themselves what was to come. James and Jude in particular would be completely transformed by the work Jesus did. Yet, for now, Jesus was content to allow them to poke fun. They were his brothers, after all. Jesus stood to his feet and patted Jude on the shoulders.
Ah, my brothers, you shall have to go on without me. My time has not yet come.
Simon scoffed.
Do you not have people waiting for you in Jerusalem? How is it that you claim to be so close to God, but avoid the people of God? Stop wasting your time in Galilee with all these fishermen.
Jesus shrugged.
As I said, my time to show myself has not yet come. However, for you, my brothers, it is always time. The world hates me because I testify to its wickedness, yet the world does not hate you. Nobody lies in wait for you, and nobody seeking to kill you, so go and be free. I am sure I will see you soon.
So his brothers departed with the rest of the caravan. Musicians sat in their carriages with their lyres, and the children played their flutes. It was a joyous occasion for any Jew. However, Jesus had a mission. Once the caravan left, he silently and secretly made his way to Jerusalem. The brothers approached the grand city of Jerusalem. It was teeming with life. The marketplaces were bustling with fresh produce and fine items. Families from different nations and regions danced through the city streets, taking in the glory of God's city. The temple was central, like the beating heart of the city. From it, thousands of people poured in and out daily, making sacrifices and offering prayers to God. On the outskirts of the city, hundreds of tents and booths were set up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Children ran to and from each tent, rolling around in the grass. Women started fires to cook food as the men sat among one another, laughing and crafting their tents. The brothers of Jesus could not help but feel slightly sorrowful that Jesus was not with them. For 3 years now, he had been traveling from region to region, preaching and healing. They missed him. Perhaps that is why they ridiculed him so often. The brothers sat by the fire, waiting for the feast to begin. They exchanged stories of their childhood and laughed, making mention of Jesus often. The few of the people around them took notice and approached their fire.
Are you the brothers of Jesus?
They asked. The brothers nodded.
Where is he? Has he come with you to the feast?
He is remaining in Galilee.
Joseph replied quickly. They often grew tired of answering questions about Jesus. However, more and more people listened in and huddled near the fire. They disputed among themselves. Some would say, "He is a good man." Others would whisper, "He is the Messiah." Then more would respond, "He's leading people astray." Nobody was in agreement to the character of Jesus. not even his own brothers. Meanwhile, in the temple, the religious leaders were teaching a large crowd. They spoke of the law and devotion to the temple economy. As they spoke, Jesus weaved his way through the crowds, remaining anonymous under a cloak. He remained hidden, observing the people as they sought answers to life's greatest questions. He listened to the Pharisees fumble the word of God and teach it as a means to control and manipulate. Without a word, Jesus removed his hood and walked to the other side of the temple. Slowly, people began to recognize him. The Pharisees watched as the attention of the crowd was diverted to the other side of the temple. Like a shifting tide, the amount of people listening to them reduced to nearly nothing. They looked to the other side of the temple and saw Jesus proclaiming the mercy, justice, love, and triumph of the kingdom of God. The Jews marveled. Many of them had not listened to him before. The locals of Jerusalem were connoisseurs of good teaching. They listened often to the rhetoric of Hebrew scholars and debate between rabbis. However, as they listened to Jesus, they heard things that they had never heard before. "How is it that this uneducated man can say such things?" they asked. Jesus held out his arms.
My teaching is not my own. It is from the one who sent me.
Some in the crowd began to recognize Jesus as the one whom the Pharisees were plotting to kill. "How is it that people in the city are wanting to kill him, yet he stands here boldly for all to see?" The crowd was stirring, questioning who Jesus really was.
Who is this man?
They asked.
Can it be that he really is the Christ?
Jesus scanned the crowd. He stretched out his arms and gestured to them.
You know who I am. You know where I came from. I've been sent by God. I know him. I come from him, and it is he who guides me.
As the words left Jesus' mouth, the crowd erupted in rage. They called for him to be arrested. They spat in his direction and called him a blasphemer. Yet many people believed in him. At the edge of the temple, Jesus' brothers watched in awe. As Jesus continued speaking, the Pharisees called for the guards to arrest him.
"He is a blasphemer!"
They yelled.
"Seize him!"
So the guards approached the platform where Jesus taught. They marched with their swords drawn, ready to take Jesus by force. However, they slowed their pursuit as they heard Jesus speak. They heard about depths of God's goodness, the origin of justice, and the meaning behind the law. They were enraptured by his sermon. So instead of arresting him, they sheathed their swords and listened. The Pharisees were outraged that they could not lay a hand on Jesus, so they sought to end him in secret. Their rage boiled with a quiet and ancient evil. They did not know it, but they were being played as pawns in the hand of a great enemy. In the secrecy of night, the Pharisees plotted how they might kill him. Nicodemus remained in the back of the room, silently listening. Nobody knew that he had once visited Jesus and had been transformed by his words. He cleared his throat to get the room's attention. Nicodemus was respected among the Pharisees. His teaching was highly sought after, and he was known as one of the deepest thinkers of the day. All were silent as Nicodemus stood.
"You would condemn this man without a trial?"
Nicodemus asked.
"Why would we not truly inquire about his actions, to see if he really is who people say he is?"
Yet his words fell flat. The group was more concerned with their power than the truth. So Nicodemus shrunk back, scheming about how he could possibly stop what was about to happen. It was morning, and the sun was peeking through the fig trees as Jesus lay underneath. The morning haze caused the light to disperse in hundreds of directions, illuminating the blooming flowers and morning dew. Jesus walked the garden at the Mount of Olives and prayed. He breathed in the crisp air and felt the first rays of the sun gently touch his face. He listened to the babbling brook Kidron and watched the clear water run through the garden. He would be back here soon. It would be a less peaceful experience than this. The day was getting closer. Jesus departed from the Mount of Olives and sat at the temple courtyard. He leaned his head against the wall, enjoying a moment of silence with his God. Then he heard a mob of people approaching. In front of the throng of people were a few Pharisees and scribes dragging a woman through the dirt by her hair. Her screams were louder than the mob of people. Jesus stood to his feet and marched towards them. They saw Jesus and threw the woman to the ground at his feet. Her face hit the dirt with a thud. She gasped for air as she turned to her side. Jesus could see the bruises on her wrists from the men who grabbed her. Her clothes were torn and falling off her body, and blood was running down her temple. Jesus looked up at the men standing over her. They wore smug grins and pointed to the woman.
"Teacher,"
one of the Pharisees shouted,
"this woman has been caught in adultery. According to the law of Moses, she should be stoned,"
they said, trying to trap him into forgiving a woman who was clearly guilty. One of the Pharisees grabbed the woman by the hair and shouted,
"So what do you say now, Jesus? What shall be done to her? Will you obey the law of Moses, or compromise yet again to befriend whores and sinners?"
Jesus' heart beat faster. They had made a spectacle of this woman. They had reduced her to nothing. The whole crowd looked upon her with disgust and spat in her direction. The woman shrunk in shame. She curled into herself, covering her ears as she listened to people scoff at her. She knew what people did to women caught in adultery. She knew she was about to be stoned. Jesus looked up at the people. Underneath Jesus' blank expression was a rumbling of anger. Not anger towards the woman, but the men who would treat her like an animal to prove a point. He knew they did not care about the woman's sin. They desired to trap Jesus, and they were willing to stone this woman to validate themselves. Within Jesus was the power of heaven. Behind the common frame of a Hebrew was the creator of the universe. With a word, he could destroy all of them, yet he kept his power sheathed. He would not address them in the way they deserved. Even the corrupt deserved a chance to repent. So Jesus took 2 steps forward and crouched down in the dirt. He began to write words in the dust with his finger. There was a silence as the religious leaders read what Jesus was writing. The woman peeked her eyes over. She could not see what Jesus was writing, but she could notice that it made the Pharisees uncomfortable. Jesus stood to his feet and looked at them. He picked up a stone off the floor and walked towards them. Their eyes widened. Jesus was unpredictable to them. Would he stone the woman, or would he attack them? The crowd took a few steps back, bracing for Jesus to strike them down. Instead, he reached out with the stone resting on his palm.
"If anyone among you is without sin, let him throw the first stone."
Jesus dropped the stone in front of the woman and Pharisees. It fell to the floor with a thud. Everyone was silent. Jesus knelt down again and continued writing in the dirt. The men looked at his words written in the dust, and one by one they began to leave. Each man, beginning with the oldest, departed in a hurry. The woman watched as the men grumbled. Their faces were filled with worry. Perhaps they did not want anyone to read what Jesus was writing. Perhaps it was about them. The Pharisees and scribes left without a word. They grumbled as they departed swiftly so no one would talk to them. The crowds also departed, for there was no longer a spectacle to watch. All that remained was Jesus and the woman. Her body was bruised and bleeding from being dragged in the dirt. She covered herself best she could. They had drug her out of her bed, right in the act of adultery, yet the man had not been taken. She was frustrated, ashamed, and alone. Jesus walked over to her and knelt onto the floor. He took the robe off his back and draped it over her shoulders. He met the woman's eyes and then gestured to the empty courtyard.
Tell me,
He said.
who is left to shame you?
The woman looked around. Her tears fell into the dirt before Jesus. She shook her head and answered,
No one, my Lord.
Jesus propped up her chin so her eyes met his.
Then neither do I shame you.
He helped the woman to her feet and brushed the dirt off her clothes.
Leave now in freedom. Go and sin no more.
So the woman departed, feeling the full weight of grace. Jesus outstretched his arms to the people and proclaimed,
I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep.
He then pointed to the Pharisees.
The hired hand sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep to save himself. He cares nothing for the sheep.
Jesus paced the ground outside the temple.
I am the good shepherd, and I will lay down my life for the sheep. They will hear me and listen to my voice. Know this, whatever may come in the future, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down willingly for the sake of those God has given to me. I have the authority to lay down my life, and I have the authority to raise it up again.
As he said these things, there was another division among the Jews. Many of them said,
He has a demon. He's insane. Why listen to him?
Others said,
These are not the words of one who's oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?
Jesus left from there, healing the blind and rebuking the Pharisees for their lack of compassion over the lost. All the while, their hatred for him grew. The name of Jesus became a point of debate between people in Jerusalem. While people from Galilee rejoiced in his miracles, the religious elite of Jerusalem analyzed and debated them. All the while, Jesus set his heart towards the final act of his ministry. He was beginning to set his gaze on the hill outside the city, the place of the skull, Calvary.
God's heart is always for those who cannot help themselves. God's heart is for the vulnerable, the weak, and the helpless. So he sends his heroes to respond to the needs of those who cannot help themselves. This is the heart of God and the heart of his Messiah. During the time of Jesus, there were a variety of different predictions on who the Messiah would be. Very few of those predictions involved the carpenter who hung out with blind men, tax collectors, and fishermen. Jesus flipped everybody's expectations upside down. His constant attendance to the sick, demon-possessed, and outcast gives us a good idea of how God defines heroism. When Shammai defended the lentil field from the Philistines, he displayed true heroism. He fought for the helpless and defended the dignity of something small. Jesus was constantly paying attention to the lentil fields, those seemingly small and insignificant people who needed help. Shammai used a sword, but Jesus had a different weapon at his disposal, the Spirit of God. His disciples found themselves incapable of casting out a demon from a small boy. The boy's father was angry, confused, and beside himself with grief. Wouldn't you be? The demon's grip on this boy caused him to harm himself and the people around him. If you are a parent listening to this, you can only imagine the anguish this father was feeling. Jesus knew what the father was thinking, but he also knew what the Pharisees and scribes were thinking. They snickered at the disciples' inability to heal the boy, and that made Jesus enraged. They were so self-righteous that they had closed their hearts off to compassion. The contrast between Jesus and the Pharisees only becomes more apparent as this series continues. They would rather this boy continue to suffer than give Jesus a victory. When we have prioritized our own idea of morality over compassion and charity, we have taken a dark turn. Jesus confronted the demon and held the boy tightly so that he couldn't harm himself or anyone else. He embraced the boy with love and rebuked the tormenting spirit within him. If you have a chance to go back and listen to this scene again, I suggest you do. Imagine all the darkness that plagues your mind, then imagine Jesus' strong arms wrapping around you. You thrash, you tug away, but he doesn't let go. Instead, he speaks truth to your soul and rebukes the lies you have believed. Powerful. I also love the Father's prayer in this episode. Did you notice it? At first, it doesn't seem like a prayer, but it is. It is a prayer you and I can both pray every time we doubt. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. What an honest and simple prayer. It is a prayer I can relate to. I want to believe Jesus can do anything, but sometimes I can't get myself to a place of full surrender and trust. Pray to God. Declare your belief in him, but also ask him to help you where your faith may fail. After Jesus helped the boy, he had a moment alone with his disciples to prepare their heart for the troubles ahead. The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men, Jesus said. They will kill him, and he will be raised again on the third day. Our hero will eventually be taken by soldiers and nailed to a cross. He will bleed and hang like a criminal. He wanted to prepare his disciples so that they might have hope, but they never seemed to get it. I wonder why that was. Why did the cross still seem like a surprise? Jesus spent a lot of time warning them of his death and resurrection. I think God is often speaking to us, giving us reminders and guidance for the future. However, some things go in one ear and out the other. It is only when we truly experience those things for ourselves that we possess what God has been telling us all along. Nevertheless, Jesus was patient with his disciples. He loved them like a shepherd loves his sheep. Jesus loved Peter as well, providing for him in the small ways and the big. There are probably 1,000 profound points we could extrapolate from the fish and the coin, but I would rather remind us of a simple point. God cares about the small things like paying your bills or getting your car fixed. He notices your minor insecurities and hidden embarrassments. All these things are seen by Jesus, and he wants to attend to your needs. If you feel like the small, accumulated issues in your life don't matter to God, let me remind you that they do. Speaking of Jesus' heart for small things, this episode gave us a glimpse into Jesus' heart for children. When asked about what it takes to be great in God's kingdom, Jesus answered with, "You see these children? They are humble and approach me with joy. Their faith is pure and undefiled. Whoever is like one of these children is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." God wants us to approach him with childlike faith. The faith a child has when they jump into their parents' arms or run to them when they are afraid is the same faith we're called to. Children have no problem expressing their needs or acknowledging their emotions. They also, hopefully, trust their parents and lean on their understanding of the world. This is how God desires us to approach him, honestly, with pure hearts and humble spirits. This episode was not all good feelings and pleasant sayings, though. As the children ran off to play, Jesus gives the crowd a stern warning. It was perhaps one of the harshest things Jesus ever said. Whoever accepts and loves a child in my name also receives me. However, whoever causes one of these little ones harm or causes them to sin, it would be better for him to have a stone fastened around his neck and thrown into the bottom of the sea. You heard that correctly. Jesus said it would be better to drown in the bottom of the sea than to be caught abusing a child. That's how harsh the punishment will be for those who mistreat children. Jesus was ferociously passionate about preserving the joy and faith of the little ones. Children are not just our future, they are our present. They are a present reminder of joy, faith, and honesty. Preserving the innocence of children preserves our own innocence in a way. May we never neglect them or sit idly by while others harm them. The episode ended with a famous scene. A woman was dragged out in shame. She was caught in the act of adultery and brought before Jesus for judgment. The religious leaders wanted to test Jesus. If he showed her mercy, they would say he didn't take the law seriously. If he showed her judgment, they would say he was a hypocrite. So what does Jesus do? He writes in the sand. Many have speculated what this writing was. Some say he was listing the sins of the Pharisees. I personally like that theory. Others say that he may have been writing Jeremiah 13 when it says, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those who turn away from you shall be written in the earth, for they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living water. Either way, it struck a chord with the mob. One by one, they started to leave. All that remained were Jesus and this woman. I want us all to pause for a moment and consider this woman. She had been forcibly taken from her room, having been caught in the act of adultery. She was probably poorly clothed, without a head covering, and ashamed. On top of that, the man who was also committing adultery was nowhere to be found. She was brought out as a spectacle and nothing else. Nobody cared about her story, her past, or her shame. They wanted to judge her to feel better about themselves, no matter what it cost her. The law allowed for public stoning, so you can imagine her fear when Jesus picked up a stone. However, all he said was, if anyone among you is without sin, let him throw the first stone. People left, and she stood face to face with love incarnate. What do you think she felt? What whirlwind of emotions were circling in her head? She got a taste of pure and undefiled mercy that day. Jesus charged her to go and sin no more, and that is the charge for you and me today. We have been given an abundance of mercy. The punishment we deserve was removed from us. Jesus has shown compassion, kindness, and grace. What should we do with it? Paul says in Romans 6, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Jesus was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in the newness of life. Christ died the death we deserve so that we might live the life he lived. Mercy gives us the freedom to go and sin no more. He hung like us so we can walk like him. Hallelujah. Jesus truly is the good shepherd. He laid down his life for us. We, as his sheep, can live in freedom from fear and shame. My parting prayer for you is that you would listen to his voice and be empowered to go and sin no more. In our next episode, we will witness the miracle that sealed Jesus' fate. So far, the religious leaders have been able to tolerate his healings on the Sabbath and signs in small towns. But this next miracle was too big to ignore. Join us next time for episode 13. Lazarus, come out. Thank you for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Share this podcast with a family member or friend so that they can know Jesus in a personal way. You never know how great of an impact the Bible and this podcast can have on someone's life. God bless.